Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It's Wednesday, December 26th. I hope everybody had a Merry Christmas, and in the spirit of the holiday season, let me say I wish the president and his family all the best as well. But as we move toward the end of the year, now's the time we need to take stock of everything. How are we doing personally? How are our children and how are other family members doing? Are they thriving? Do we need more help in certain areas? Are they doing great in others, but might need just a little push some other direction? How are we doing as a country? And how are our leaders doing? You know, as we approach 2019, those of us who remain eternally optimistic about this great republic of ours have reason to be concerned. Little children continue to die in the custody of the U.S. government. And remember, friends, that's our government. That's your government and my government that's allowing little children to die while they're being incarcerated because of a policy that's supposed to discourage people from coming. And thousands of children still remain incarcerated. And still, this holiday season, this Christmas season, they're still separated from their parents. What would Jesus do? That's where Jesus would be. That would be the issue. If you read the New Testament, if you read the Gospels, that's exactly what Jesus would be concerned about, and what evangelicals who support this president and who claim to have influence over this president should be focused on in moving his policy. Let the little children come, not even close. Now, that same government that is holding all of these children along the border is largely shut down in Washington because a Republican president refuses to accept, he won't even accept a deal that Republicans and Democrats together offered him, because a few talk radio chatterers told him to prove that he was tough, he needed to shut down the government. You know, Donald Trump told Americans a couple weeks ago to blame him for the government shutdown, and now he's getting his Christmas wish. But I wish he'd work with Democrats and Republicans to open it back up. You know, and I know, and unfortunately the world knows, that the president pushed out his defense secretary last week while he was pushing cowardly policies that are going to surrender large parts of Syria to Russia, Iran, and ISIS. He then demanded that Marine general, who is so respected in the military and around the world, leave immediately. And now the president, on almost a daily basis, is talking about firing the man he put in charge of the Federal Reserve. Because Donald Trump is in desperate need to explain why the stock market is having its worst December since the Great Depression. It's in a free fall. Now, as you know, real leaders like Harry Truman, who said the buck stops here. In fact, he put it on his desk in the White House to say, the buck stops here. I take the responsibility. Real leaders, they take responsibility when things go wrong on their watch. JFK did it after the Bay of Pigs. He said, failure is an orphan, and I accept it. Well, it would never occur to Donald Trump that his disastrous trade policies, his record-setting debt, his liberal spending, his liberal deficit spending, and his erratic behavior are the biggest drivers of this market's downturn. The whole world is watching what's happening in America this holiday week. And the world is rightly concerned. In fact, some could say the world is rightly scared. Let me remind you and Donald Trump that this morning, I don't judge the president by my standards. You don't have to judge the president by your standards. This morning, just judge him by his own standards. The standards that Donald Trump set when he was a candidate running for president of the United States. And if you do that, if you take a couple of minutes to go on the internet, to do a couple of basic searches on Google, you will see that Donald Trump is failing by every benchmark that he laid out in his own campaign, his campaign promises. Those fiery stump speeches that we saw day in and day out through 2016, and the blizzard of tweets that we've been reading about for 5 years. Go back and read them. They're all seconds away for you, seconds away from being searched by you and any Trump supporter who still refuses to face the truth about their president's failings of leadership. I take no pleasure in saying that because, as the great General Hayden told me, Joe, we only have one president, and we've got to do everything we can to make that president succeed. He told me that during the transition. Other leaders told me that during the transition. I took that to heart, and I know that they were right. But we all can't do it alone. Donald Trump, at some point, needed to step up and show leadership. And if he couldn't do it, then those around him who influenced him should have done it. As some of you know, I left the Republican Party less over Donald Trump than I did over the fact that almost every elected official in the GOP has bowed and scraped to Donald Trump, treating this man, whose skills are objectively declining on a daily basis. They treated this man like he was an emperor wearing the finest clothes ever made, when in fact, objectively, Donald Trump is on track to be the worst president in modern times, and perhaps ever, pushing even James Buchanan off that dubious perch. And I haven't even brought up the Mueller investigation and the fact that this president has practically confessed to obstructing justice and violating campaign finance laws that are felonies. That are felonies, Republicans. You know, the coming events in that legal drama are going to be a large part of our collective 2019. But right now, world leaders, financial markets, members of Congress of both parties, even senior members of Donald Trump's own administration are appalled and confused by his behavior. And they're worried about the impact that his behavior is having on the real lives of real people all over America. There's a right way to make national security decisions, like drawing down U.S. military personnel in Syria and Afghanistan, but only after ISIS is completely destroyed and the Taliban are in check. You don't do it in the middle of the negotiations with the Taliban so they can walk away from the table and say, all right, we know you're going to go. We have no reason to talk to you anymore. There's a right way to do it, and there's a wrong way to do it. A wrong way to make and announce those decisions. There's a right way to work through the difficulties of moving toward essential legislative compromise. Great presidents do it. Presidents that know how Washington works do it. You know, Bill Clinton knew how to do it. LBJ knew how to do it. Ronald Reagan knew how to do it. FDR knew how to do it. There is a right way to do it, and there is a wrong way to do it. There's a right way to reassure markets during panic sell-offs and a wrong way. Now, some have called the last week of the Trump presidency the worst to date. Last week obviously has a lot of competition in that category, but let's not quibble with those who believe that right now, what is going on right now, is the most challenging moment we have faced since this man took office almost 2 years ago. This morning, we're going to talk about what happens next, how America's other leaders and how leaders across the world can work together and work around what Donald Trump has wrought. Because the days of waiting for this president to change how he operates, and the days of hoping that he can somehow achieve more and do better, those days are behind us. 2019 is going to be far different. And here, thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.